Hi there. Today I'm here with Ricardo Sueiras. Ricardo is a developer advocate at AWS in London. And I'm super excited to talk to him about like services on AWS, how to set up developer environments, what the workflows are, and what you can build on top of it. Ricardo, thanks for being here. How's it going?
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, it's going great. It's a lovely Monday in winter here in the UK. So that means grey and rain.
Yeah,
But it also means more time spent, geeking out, right, and building things.
absolutely. Same here. All gray, kind of wet. But anyway,
We live for these days, right? These are
yeah,
this is our most productive sort of part of the year.
yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. So tell us, what is it that you're productive in? So what are you working on at AWS?
Right. So I think for the last couple of years, I have been really laser focused on helping developers get the best out of these AI coding assistants. So that's where I've really kind of like doubled down. And I've spent many years, over like 35 years working in tech, actually spending or helping developers kind of get the best out of either the environments they're working in,
Mm.
the tools they're using, or even organizationally, right? So I'm kind of really enjoying this new kind of wave of tools because they're kind of like helping us kind of take a step back and rethink everything, right? So yeah, it's super interesting at the moment.
Yeah, so you have AWS has its own coding agent or a
We
coding
do.
assistant.
We have a few, right? So we have Amazon Q Developer, which is a plugin for VS Code. So for
Mhm.
those organizations that are locked into VS Code or IntelliJ, you can use that plugin. And then we also have our own VS Code fork, Kiro, which is a very opinionated IDE. It's really awesome, and it's kind of more geared towards trying to again redefine what the developer experience is in the agentic AI. So rather than kind of like mimicking like for like what a VS Code fork might look like, it actually takes a new approach, which is basically learning from what we've been doing over the last 18 months when using AI coding assistants, and then breaking it down into something called spec-driven development. Okay, so it's kind of like it's growing, kind of in momentum, but really kind of like most people have heard of vibe coding, right? Where
Mhm.
you provide information to the AI coding assistant, and then you leave it, and the agent AI just generates loads of code, right? I call that AI unleashed. So you're using the maximum potential of the AI coding system, right? But you got very little control. Well, I
Yeah,
say that you have some control, right? You got context files you can put, you can put some guardrails, that kind of thing. Whereas spec kind of like takes a slightly different approach and it's a workflow, right? And you start
yeah.
off with intent. You start off defining what you want to build. From there, you then work on a design, and then from the design, you then start implementing code. But each of those is like there's checkpoints that you can review, shape, change. So it feels like you're more in control, and the units of code produced is smaller, right?
Yeah.
And that is very important, because it means that your surface area of code that you need to understand at any review time is smaller, so you feel like you're in more control. And anecdotally, when I speak to developers, and I also felt this as well, I kind of get a stronger relationship to the actual output project, but I guess the downside is it's slower, right? So it
Well,
takes more time. um
absolutely. I
yeah.
was lucky enough to be on the first beta invite list.
Oh,
So I played out a bit with that. And
cool.
it's super amazing because you feel, like, as you said, you feel you're in total control. And on the downside, it's generating, well, let's say, very enterprisey markdown documents
Yeah.
with all the shall and must not and all those keywords, which is super great, but it feels a bit clumsy if you're just used to vibe code your way through those agents.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean that the format you're referring to is called EARS, which is
yeah,
Easy Application Requirements Syntax. which actually came out of Rolls-Royce 20 years ago.
Well,
So
enterprisey.
well, yeah, but they're also a very strong engineering heritage, right? And
Absolutely.
they the engineers there obviously felt the value of these formal specifications, because I have in the past, many moons ago, I did work with many customers who were in the aviation industry, and one thing that struck me was their attention to detail, and that's important, right? Because people's lives depend on it, right? So the whole supply chain of anything to do with aircraft is dotting the I's and crossing the T's,
Yeah.
triplicate, four eyes review, all that kind of stuff. And so it does move maybe, slowly, but there's precision in there, there's purpose. And so they build stuff that is solid, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
actually, the aviation industry is interesting for lots of reasons, because back in the day, I'm not an aviation geek at all, right? But these are like stories you pick up. The reason why, if you were flying in the like 20s or 30s in the early passenger jets, or not jets, propeller planes, you were like, you were rolling the dice, right?
Yeah, bro.
And because the reliability was just not there, and the amount of accidents they had. And actually, it took the fact that these aircraft companies wanted to increase passenger numbers for them to get together and create standards, right? It's why we have the black box, right? To drive up trust in the customers. So there's kind of like there is a heritage going back to this moment where stuff wasn't unreliable, people didn't trust it, and they started developing and focusing on black boxes and other mechanisms, right? And I can't help wonder if maybe we're in that, or coming towards a similar conclusion in software, because today software runs everything, right?
Yeah, probably the other part of that would be healthcare or anything related to the medical field.
Yeah, which about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is my daily bread and butter, but yeah, totally can relate to that. Is this, by the way, where the differentiation between dry and wet, like don't repeat yourself and write everything twice, comes from?
So that's an interesting one. I don't know. I don't know, because for me those terms have come in my lifetime, not before, right? So I don't know. I don't know if they come from, but that's an interesting comment, because I just finished reading a book called The Philosophy of Software Design. Okay, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book, but it's a very short book. And then there's a chapter. It's only 2 pages, and it makes a bold statement, right? And that bold statement is that when, as developers, we write software, the first version we write, we should throw away, delete.
Absolutely.
Right. Oh, okay. So yeah. Good. You're in accordance.
Totally
right?
Agree.
And the second version too.
Well, that depends.
Yeah. So actually, I don't think it says throw away the second. It says that your second version of a piece of software will always be better than the first version, right? And any developer knows that as soon as they hear that, they get that moment where this has happened to them, and they go, you know what, you're absolutely right, And one of the things that I've realized over the last 6 months is that with these AI coding assistants, they do allow developers to throw away code in a way that's efficient. I mean, not efficient necessarily maybe in the amount of tokens it's cost to generate them. So that isn't efficient, and that's not good.
That's another story, yes.
But it from a time perspective and a quality perspective, it allows us to kind of go back and redo things in a way that allows us to unpick any mistakes we made. Not maybe mistakes, but maybe we forgot about some assumptions. Okay, and that has a big impact on the architecture or the code. And I'm working on this fun little game. So it's not a game. It is a kind of a game. It's a quiz which we're going to be running at the AWS events, right? And it's for anyone who went to an AWS event last year. We had something called the Amazon Q Coding Challenge, and we're creating the successor of that. Now, we're live streaming this, so actually it's on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So for folks who, if this goes out before then, check out Sally and mine live stream, and we're coding this out in sort of public. And one of the things that I've been doing to prepare for this is actually sort of like go through the process, right? And one of the components of this is a game engine, right? Or sorry, not great, a question and answer engine, right? The ability to, we want to ask people questions and we want to get responses. So V1, right? V1 was like just basically vibe coding something just to kind of flesh out the ideas. And it worked, right? We got there, it worked. It was actually pretty solid. But then we realized, oh, we want this, we want that. Oh, actually, you know what? We need to change this around. Okay.
We haven't prepared for that.
Yeah. So we threw it away. But what we did is we took all the stuff that we had observed, put it in and augmented the original prompt. And also importantly, because we had a data model that initialized in the first version, which we realized wasn't actually what we needed, right? We needed to start the data model. So V2 came along and it was actually pretty damn good, right? But then we realized we were missing some key functionality about evaluating the answer, especially for a coding challenge, right? You don't want to evaluate that in the process because you could get a nefarious person that says writes a script to delete the entire machine. That's it. Your machine at the event is gone, right? So we went through iterations. We're now at iteration 5, right? And now we are getting to a point where this thing is absolutely, it's singing and dancing, right? So I think this iterating, right, and this has only been over a period of like maybe 2 days. We've done this, and so I often tell developers this, that one of the things that these AI coding tools can help you do is actually refine and help you get deeper understanding in the problem space that you are being asked to build software for.
Yeah. I think the point here is like these iterative processes, think of Scrum or Kanban or something like that, they actually put the prototype out of the game. Because there was just add some more stuff, add more features. Here's a ticket, and then let's see how that ends up in the velocity of our sprint.
Yeah, totally.
But honestly, you would need that prototype. So that's why I totally agree to throw the first version away. And you're also totally right about like AI doing the hard stuff. In our backlog, we have so many to-dos for refactoring that sat there for weeks and even months, some even years. Nobody touched them. And now with AI, we can it doesn't mean that it's perfect now, but it's certainly better than it was before. And we got things from our backlog clear that are like improved the quality actually.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I do encourage people to experiment with these outside the normal constraints of just the IDE. So we have a command line version of Kiro called Kiro CLI, and it allows you to define agents, custom agents, which you basically you can create attributes for, right? So you can give it like a personality. So for example, you could be software developer, like hotshot software developer. Then you could be hardcore critiquer, right? You could be guru data person. And so I've been building up a collection of these. I've got a GitHub repo where I share these because I believe in working out in the open. In this phase where we currently are, everyone is learning from everyone, right?
Which GitHub repository is that?
So it's on I think it's called AI Agent Resources. I think it's called. I'll share you the link afterwards if you want. You can put it in the show notes. You can put it in the notes. Yeah. So these enable you to do some really cool things, and no one really has actually, I think, got to that stage where they've said, right, it's done now. We know how this works. Move on, right? Every few weeks, someone comes up with a really, really cool new way or new trick, right? And so it's really important as developers that you spend some time. I don't know how much time, but some time in exploring the capabilities of what they can do now, and then using your own curiosity to then explore. So I did a post a few weeks ago on player coach model. That came from a paper that I read over Christmas. and effectively it's two agents. One is a player agent, and one is a coach, right? And they're defined with a prompt system prompt and supporting resources. So the player in this instance is the coder.
Mm-hmm.
The coach is the code review, and I've given them supporting resources, and I can share this a post with you in the notes. And then I have an orchestrator, and the orchestrator says, I want to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the steps are: the player will produce something, and then it will pass it to the reviewer. The reviewer then basically has to say, pass on fail on this criteria. If it passes, it can move to the next step, right?
Got it.
So the idea here is that basically you're now defining not just the fact that the player's got to do something, the criteria that it's going to be measured by, and the person that's going to do it. And this allows you to catch things like quality, consistency, and so, I mean, it produced some interesting output. I mean, it was slow, right? It was slow, but I think this is the kind of experiments that people need to be trying, right? Just trying different workflows, trying different experiments like that to see how they can make these tools work in different ways. Because what I found is that if you're tackling something with an AI agent and it doesn't quite work as you expect, if you try a different approach, you typically get, good. There's always a way, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about like generating code, whether that's by hand or with AI agents, but now it's time to actually let it run, or AKA deploy it.
Yeah.
And this is also where AWS apparently comes into play.
Yes, it does.
But let us first stick with the AI agents for a bit. Is there on AWS a service where you could spin up like a sandbox for such agents?
Yes, indeed, there is. In fact, this is what I've been playing with. So let's kind of like set the context. So if you're building with AI, let's say we've already talked about the tooling to build with AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
But let's imagine you're building an application. Let's say, for example, your business wants you to explore how you can use generative AI to do, let's say, summarize some information, okay, or generate some content based on some criteria, maybe an image and video and all that kind of stuff.
Or just OCR a picture, or whatever kind of else stuff, right? Your workflow is. Yeah.
Now there are a bunch of when you build a solution like that, there's a bunch of components, right? You as developers put together. First of all, there's a model you'll choose, right? And on Amazon, on AWS, that's typically where you go to Amazon Bedrock, right? Amazon Bedrock contains hundreds of different models you can use, makes it super easy to choose models based on the criteria you've got. Okay, tick in the box. But model itself is no good. You have to write some software to go with it. And I'm an open source guy. You're an open source guy, right? We know that open source developers solve these kind of problems, and there are loads of different frameworks, right? Now we have one called the Strands Agent Framework. Get it right. It's a really, really good open source project. It's one of my favorite at the moment, and I know I work for AWS, so I'm biased, but actually I've used quite a few of these, right? I mean, I originally started in LangChain, which is also great. But Strands Agent just makes it just ridiculously easy, right, to create generative AI, agentic AI applications in like literally 2 or 3 lines of code. I mean, the developer experience is super, super easy. Have you used or heard of Strands Agent, Baz?
Not yet.
Right. Okay. Well, let me walk you through it then.
Let's basically start with what you can build. Because is it a coding agent? Is it like
no? It's a framework. It's a library. It's a library.
I mean, the stuff that you are building with that, is that something where you ingest documents and then pass
it can be anything,
invoice
right?
IDs or
okay. I'll give you an example, right? I have an open source newsletter that I run every month, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to see if I could use generative AI to automate it, because the workflow is pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
I go through every month and I collect articles, right? Only the ones I like, right? I read them, and if I like them, I put them on a list. So I have a list of URLs, right, of blog posts.
I see where that's going.
Yeah, you see where it's going, and also GitHub projects, right? So GitHub repos. People send me every month loads of these repos. I know, Rick, I've got this really cool project. Check it out, and I'll check it out. Sometimes I'll actually install it, run it, play around with it. I don't have as much time as I used to do that. Anyway, and so I thought what I'll do is I'll build an application, right, that will automate some of the process, and some of the process is trying to summarize a blog post in 1 or 2 sentences, right? Or get the GitHub repo, right, and generate a summary of that, plus get the links and the author details, right? So when you look at it, what I do manually is I will currently today or let's say last month, I would go through every single one of these blog posts. I will read them. I will create a summary. I will find the author. I'll put the author in there. I'll create a link, and then I'll generate a shortcut link for that. And I'll do that in a standardized way. And I'll do the same thing for Git repos. I'll do the same thing for community posts. I'll do the same thing for what's news, right? And I thought, there's got to be a better way of doing this, right? Because it takes me a day to do.
Yeah, totally.
And so I basically first of all started with Kiro. I configured the Strands Agent MCP server and the Amazon Bedrock MCP servers, which are my go-tos, right, when I start. And all these do is basically they make it available because obviously Strands Agent and Amazon Bedrock is changing all the time. The information in the model is probably not going to know about Strands Agent or Amazon Bedrock. So I put it there just so that the LLM can infer or get that information from those MCP servers. And then I built an application in probably about an hour, 2 hours maybe, that has automated the entire process, right? And it is so slick, right? It's so slick. And actually, I didn't stop there. Another use case, I have like over 350 blog posts on Dev2, and I need to update some URLs on it because the URLs are changed. Now, there's Dev2 has a brilliant API, right? So what I did is using Strands Agent, I built a CLI tool in about 30 minutes that provided me with such detailed command line options. So I could do one post, I could do all posts, I could do dry runs, I could create backups, I created logs to see it would, a report. It did that in 30 minutes, right? And so, Strands Agents allows you to build these kinds of applications, really, really easily. So if you haven't tried it today, Baz, you've got to try Strands Agent. It makes it really, really super easy to work. But this is the second stage, right? So we've got our model, right? We've got our framework, and typically, you need to run it somewhere, right? So you could run it on your machine, you could run it on a virtual machine, you can run it in a container, right? But here's the thing, right? As we build agentic applications, we're using a bunch of primitives to make these things. So, for example, I mentioned in my game thing, I need to be able to run this in a sandbox because you want to run agents in a sandbox so that they don't accidentally do something you don't want them to do.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, you want to give agents access to memory, short-term and long-term memory, so that as they work, they don't start from scratch. And there are open source tools and frameworks that allow you to plug this in and build this in. So LangFuse, for example, is a really good one for observability, for example. Allows you to see how your agent application is working so that you can do things like, for example, check tokens in, tokens out, so you can manage the cost, that you can see and track errors. You can track things like your guardrails, right? And so the developer starts building up this stack, right, of open source components. A lot of them are open source. In fact, if not all of them open source. And so, and that works great. Okay. But introduced kind of think like late last year, AWS produced or released something called Amazon Bedrock Agent Core, right? Which is effectively a bunch of primitives that do that take all those components. Now, they're not open source. That's my only gripe. Okay. They are opinionated and they provide everything you need. So you can still take, I can take my Strands project and I can now basically deploy it literally in a few commands, right, in Agent Core.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it's effectively, it manages everything for me. So I now have lovely sandboxed environments that I've got, access to memory, short-term, long-term memory. I've got observability. I've got security. And so this is where
That's
Amazon
crazy.
Bedrock kicks in, right? So I think, and it's still very, very new, still evolving very quickly. But Bedrock now Agent Core is really kind of like becoming my go-to for where I deploy those agentic applications. So, we need things to build those agentic applications, and we need things to deploy them onto. And so these are your new primitives, right? So think before you were developing applications on Lambda or ECS or EC2. Now, as you build agentic applications, you can still use those, but Agent Core becomes another set of primitives. And what they do effectively is they remove all the undifferentiated heavy lifting, leaving it just so that you can focus on what you really want to build, right? I'm finding it, actually a really nice experience. And we have so Python is the if you're writing things in Python, you're covered, right?
Yeah.
But not everyone builds these applications on Python. So at reInvent, we launched a TypeScript version of the TypeScript.
That's the other half of developers, I guess.
Yeah, exactly, of the Strands Agents. But you can deploy both of those onto Agent Core. And a nice example is that I talked about the gaming engine, the Q&A engine, right? So there's a type of question which is a coding question, and basically I asked Kiro to make sure it runs in a sandbox, and by sandbox I mean the Agent Core sandbox.
Yeah.
Totally. And because my V1, okay, I talked about V1 to V2 to V5. V1 I was running on a Finch container locally, so it literally was spinning up a container, doing the evaluation in there, so it was sandbox that way, and then returning the response. And it was quick, right? Because I had my Finch my Finch container running. So actually, Finch is AWS's open source container runtime tool for Macs, right? So it replaces, or it's equivalent to Rancher, Podman, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't use Docker on my machine. That's why I use Finch. Now that worked okay, right? And it was quick. But when I deployed it onto Bedrock, it used the Bedrock sandbox, and I thought it wasn't working at first because it was so quick. It was doing the evaluation. I could see it in the logs that evaluated, and it was working, and it was instant. It was so quick, and I thought, this is not working. This is definitely not working. But it was, right? And this is the crazy thing. And when you look at the documentation, it actually, that's one of the features of the runtime, Agent Core runtime, is that it's really, really quick. But what I discovered is that currently Agent Core runtime supports Python, JavaScript, and TypeScript only, no Java. So I'm currently trying to figure out how to do Java in a similar way, right?
Yeah. I love the use case so much because actually I can totally relate. I had some similar problem where I released like hashtag this week in Python with 5 Python articles and 5 links to GitHub repositories of interesting Python project each week. And I became too lazy to write those summaries by myself and stuff like that. And then I thought there must be an even better way not to only provide the summaries, but to personalize the experience. So let's say you have a list of 100 articles that you find useful, that you have curated yourself, and then you send that out to like 10% of your subscribers, and then you see what clicks with them.
Yes.
And you count each click as a vote. And the next time, these subscribers will get personalized section from the overall 100 links collection.
I like that.
What would you need for that to build it? I gave up at some point because there were other things more important. But you would need SES for sending the emails. You would certainly need something to record the click, so that can be probably just a Lambda. And then there is in AWS this whole machine learning thing that existed way before
personalization,
before AI, to record the personalization stuff in there.
Yeah.
So
I think what I would say though is that I would take a step back. So again, this is very important. As we go to an era where we can build anything we want easily, right? I would say that because I also had similar thoughts, right? But the challenge I encountered was that in order to capture personalization, you have to capture user details, right? You have to effectively get them to log in, right? It's very difficult for them. I mean, you can use cookies and all that kind of stuff
Well,
as
if you
well.
send them an email, each link
Yeah,
in
email.
that
So
email is
email,
personalized.
and that's the thing that I didn't want to do, right? Because of privacy and data
Yeah,
protection. Because I didn't want to be a data processor. I didn't want to go
yeah,
through
sure.
all those, right? Because that then complicates your architecture. And for creating a newsletter, I want some insights, but to what level of insights am I? It's a compromise, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I didn't want to capture any email addresses, which means that, but I still wanted some insights, which is why I use tracking links. Tracking
Mhm.
links allow me to see what is hot, what people are interested in, but I can't target, that
To the
one
specific
person.
user
Yeah,
back.
which is a
Yeah.
limitation, right? And I think you need to know your audience for that. But that worked okay for me because it was a generalist newsletter, and you could. I wasn't planning on creating different versions. But if I was working, like, maybe if I had an idea to create some kind of super cool marketing platform,
Mhm.
right, to do that, then that would definitely be something that I would focus on. And all the services you mentioned would be how I would probably do it. Yeah, you definitely nailed it on the head there.
So, and this brings me to another follow-up question, basically. Like AWS has 200 plus different services. Probably there's not only a single person on that planet who
Yeah.
knows the intricacies of each. Um, so what's a good way to get a high-level picture of all those services to actually choose which ones you need and which ones are just for different use cases than yours?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? Because where do you begin?
Yeah,
how do you eat the elephant, so to speak, right? And this is something I work a lot with students, okay, and it's something that comes up. Um, one of the things that I like to do with students, for example, is I like to take things that they understand and know now, right, and
mm,
then try and walk them through some of the decision making processes that you might take as you move forward and get more experience. And that typically starts with a simple application that you might build on your laptop, right?
sure.
So the one I use is a very simple microblogging application. It's a 3-tier application, and we run it on my laptop on the local network, and people log in. They see it working, right, which is important.
Hmm.
And then I start introducing the primitives of cloud, starting with the basics, right? So compute, storage, those are the two main ones, right? Actually network as well, networking. Just to basically walk people through that. Here's an application, you can see how you get to it from your machine over the local network, a Wi-Fi router, a switch, whatever.
Hmm.
Gives you an IP address, but you're within a safe network. And then we talk about, okay, well, on this machine, we can actually run it on a virtual machine, right? We can run it on this machine, and we can run it on a Docker container in this machine, and it doesn't change anything, right? And what have we done? All we've done is we've changed the packaging of it, and we
Yeah,
introduced things like why would you do that? And this is where kind of it's as I've been through this journey over the last 30 years, I can explain what happened, why it happened, right? And that's really important because I think you do need that context, right? But increasingly now, these students are very, very comfortable not worrying or caring about the past, right? They are container native, right? They will very naturally build software, build container images, have optimized setups for that, and they don't have to worry or think about where they come from. Okay, it's more a case of now, how do I deploy it? All right,
mm,
and so this is where you then start introducing, like, okay, well, uh, we start getting them to think about the different services and the different trade-offs, right? Do you need more of one thing or one thing? So does it need to be open source? Do you need something that's open source? Do you need something that's simple, right, and just gets you started?
hmm,
Do you need something that is going to work in very, very tight, strict requirements? So we introduce functional and non-functional requirements, so to get them thinking, and then we talk about trade-offs, and then what we do is we come back to now to the new AI coding assistants, and we show them how you can use those to help you ask questions, think about the trade-offs, okay, so that they understand, okay, well, I've got this application, I want to deploy it on a container, or I want to deploy it on serverless, and this is how I can do this in AWS or something else, right? So this is kind of how we're seeing now the evolution of how you use these tools to help guide new learners, right? To understand how to approach learning. And I think that in the past, you can do tutorials, you can do blog posts about how to get started on AWS, and they're all good, they're all great. You can do those Pluralsight or Coursera training courses, and they're all good, but they're kind of like on rails, right? So you have to kind of go through the material they have, and that's good for foundational learning, but nothing beats sort of like curiosity and self learning, right? And
absolutely, that's the hacker spirit.
Yeah, giving student access to the CLI, AWS CLI, and then paired with a good AI coding assistant, it's a really, really effective way of helping them to learn how to get started on AWS. I'm not a GUI person, so I don't use the console. For me, it's got to be CLI or nothing. And a lot of the now tools kind of are CLI first kind of thing. So I think that's what it's not the only way. It's just something now increasingly that I'm seeing people do, and you need to take these students or early or people who haven't accessed or used AWS. You need to kind of take them on that journey. Start with something they're familiar with, and then walk them through it. I mean, a good example is because the compute constructs, unless you're serverless, don't really change much within the application, right?
Yeah. Sure.
But storage might. Okay, storage might get you from reading a file on the file system to accessing an object on an S3 bucket, right?
Yeah.
Although increasingly libraries now abstract that from you, right? So in theory, a good library will do all that magic for you.
Well, you mentioned containerization, and that's where you start, basically. I mean, there is a backstory to containerization. Basically, we started from, okay, here's your software, build your own data center.
Oh, yes.
Then we had, okay, at least you can rent your individual server. And then we had virtual servers, which are basically virtual machines. And then we stripped away the operating system kernel from that and just shipped the runtime in what we now call a container.
Yeah, but the reason why we had that, though, was because we had this issue whereby we were running into problems in the deployment of the step before, right? We would send and deploy our code. I mean, I was there. I was, and we would have to build so much engineering stuff, right, to simplify and make it work reliably, right?
And from a high level perspective, you could argue that like a container is basically a slimmer virtual machine in that sense that it all ships the required software. So it works on my machine, does not really matter.
I think that's the problem it solves, right? So for me, the problem it solves is that it solves that it worked on my machine issue. And when I remember in my previous company, I was head of innovation, and I was doing regular briefings with technical communities. And I remember the very first presentation I did on Docker. So this was Docker v 0.3 or something. And the presentation was virtualization is dead, the future of virtualization, which is basically Docker, right, or containerization. And in those days, right, so back in the early days, we didn't have hardly any of the features we have today. You could literally run a container, but that was it. All the service discoverability, you had to do hacky scripts with HA proxy, right? And it was really cool, but also very, very challenging, right? So now where we are today, where it's very mature, I think containerization has become, or a container has become, the deployment, thing. It's one, right?
And that is exactly where I was headed with my question. Is that the end now? So is a container the thing, or is something like serverless where for a container you stripped out the kernel from the virtual machine and you ended up with a container, and now you have something like Lambda where you just package your stuff targeted towards a specific runtime, which is already provided for you on AWS or on other providers. So is that the natural evolution? Will we see a shift from containers to actually runtime dependent deployments?
Yeah, it could be. I mean,
Lambda?
it depends. I think the answer is it depends, right? Because I love Lambda. I love serverless. In fact, when I interviewed for AWS, my demo was on Lambda. And I think for many things that we do, Lambda functions are great answer. But if you're an open source place, right? If you need some portability, if you are operating outside of the constraints of the 15 minutes for Lambda functions, then you have to think again, right? So I think it's one of those things that for many use cases it's a really strong use case. But I'm not a fan of the thou shalt always use X for Y, right? And so there are many use cases where I would consider using Lambda, but there are also many use cases where I wouldn't. So I think understand and I think some of those actually are non-functional requirements as opposed to functional requirements. So I think the evolution from a container perspective, I think they're parallel paths, not converging. We see. I guess the question is whether maybe at some point Lambda functions might be packaged up as well. They already are. You can already package them up as OCI images, can't you? But whether the actual, whether they kind of like evolve to be long-running processes and zero cold starts and all that kind of stuff, then maybe that could be, because if you look at a Docker file, the Docker file does have at the very last thing, right, the command, right?
Yeah,
which the start process. So you could argue that the life cycle, right, could align, but I don't know. I don't see that happening somehow. But it's an interesting idea.
Okay, do you like from your experience with actual customers of AWS? Have you seen stories where someone used serverless and then failed because that was the wrong choice for that use case?
I haven't actually. I haven't seen anyone that has used it and failed. But then I'm not day to day in working with customers that are using serverless. I think that's partly because I've been doing open source, right? And so typically the open source workloads tend to be on something like Kubernetes, OpenShift, and that kind of thing. So I've not seen. I'm just trying to think back now of failure specifically for serverless. But I don't have any direct experience myself.
So if it's not a direct experience, so what would your recommendation be? What would be a project that is definitely not good for serverless, but good for containerization?
So, and I've not tried this recently, so things may have changed, right? So one of the concerns I had a few years ago was where you have a serverless function that has state, specifically, connecting to a database, right? And we've got RDS proxy now, and we've got VPC and those kind of things. But it's always struck me as a bit of a hack. I don't know, but I think that the moment I start getting into, I require persistent connection to a database, I'm not so sure. DynamoDB is different. That's so I'm just talking about more relational type or that kind of thing.
Postgres, MySQL.
But again, I might be wrong because I've not tried it. You see, so there may be people out there that watch this and say, "Oh no, I need to speak to Rick because this is how you do it," right? So I think the first thing is that. Secondly, if you have got long running processes, right? So that would be another factor I think for me that I would kind of like typically not run it. And then I guess the current service has got some I guess constraints around CPU and memory. So if you have or need to run, for example, a very large model on a virtual machine, you're not going to do it on a serverless. You're going to do it on maybe EKS probably. Especially, but we're seeing a lot of people do Kubernetes based data processing and training. So maybe those are sort of some of the use cases where I probably think that serverless, but they're kind of like they're some of the the minor ones, but most others I think are probably going to be okay to use. But again, I'm probably not the best person to ask on that one. Although it does make you think, doesn't it? I think as developers, we always have a bias to what we know, right, as opposed to what we don't know. So the question is, how would I know? Maybe I've got a good use case for serverless, right? A good example, the quiz again I'm talking about. Could the quiz architecture that I've created work on serverless versus ECS, where I'm currently running it on ECS, right? So that could be an interesting one, right? So maybe there it's more a case of it could, but I need to understand or know how or have experience working with the serverless development model, right? And that becomes the barrier then, right? Because I don't do it on a regular basis. I default to creating a container image, sticking with my standard life cycle, invocation life cycle, and running it that way, rather than potentially re-architecting it in a different way.
And another question that arises from that is, like, when you have a container-based workflow, it's very easy to imagine how a development setup would look like.
Well, that's the main one, isn't it? I mean,
you can basically run Docker or whatever else distribution on your local machine, and you have the
de facto
same thing
for open source projects now, right?
It's the de facto standard, right? People can work on the same container. People can share container images and all the like.
You can do that with serverless, though. You can. So serverless provide a container image that allow you to do testing of serverless applications. I've used it, right? So
okay.
So because in the past I've created. I think it was a few years ago when I was I spent a bit of time every day on Stack Overflow. Do you remember that site that everyone used to go to?
Back in the day when there was a site called Stack Overflow.
And this one person wanted to know how to run this PDF conversion tool in a Lambda function, right? Perfect use case, right? Request comes in, need it converted, put it onto an S3 storage. That's a perfect use case for Lambda function. But the problem was that this tool, this library, was huge, right? So it required, a Lambda layer to be created to store the various images for it to work effectively. And during that piece, I discovered that there was this container image you can use. It's on the documentation. You can run locally, so that as you're developing, you can actually test locally. And it was brilliant. It was really, really good. So there are some really cool tools you can use if you want to explore and experiment with that. And obviously, we also have SAM, right? The serverless application model, which again runs locally as well. And that's one thing that I wish I'd known about sooner. I think if I had probably worked on SAM before I spent time working on containers, who knows? Maybe I would have gone to serverless as my default, right?
Yeah.
But SAM, I think SAM does change the game when it comes to making it easier to work locally, because I think most developers like to work locally, right? And I think that's for me, it's a deal breaker. If I can't run locally, then
And how exactly does it work?
What the container image? So SAM effectively provides. It allows you to effectively construct your code as well as the infrastructure together with it. So I think the current version generates CDK output and uses CDK to deploy and configure the AWS stuff, but it provides you with this localized Docker runtime, so it allows you to test locally. So you write your code, you can test locally, and then you can package up. That's then managed by CDK that manages all the creation of all the assets.
So, and that's the official solution. How does that compare to something like local?
So it's an open source project, and it is one of the ways. I don't. Is it the official? I don't know, because I don't work on SAM on a regular basis. It may be, but yeah, that's. I mean, so I think that there are tools out there, right, to help simplify working with the serverless. I just don't spend as much time on those tools as because my focus has been open source, right? So I have focused on open source tools to do stuff on AWS.
Yeah, very cool. So I want to circle back quickly about like your project that you put in as part of your hiring process.
Oh yes,
And I assume that AWS is still a company that is very attractive for people to apply. So maybe you can share some insights on what they're actually looking for.
yeah. So I think the key thing is that they're looking for that builder mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a bunch of leadership principles. There's 16 of them, but and those are taken very seriously during the hiring process. So irrespective, right, of what you know, those are the first thing you need to know, right? A good example is that even though I started working on cloud in 2008, I actually spent most of my time on Azure and GCP. And when I did my loop, I had spent
Mm-hmm.
I was basically just doing GCP, right? I wasn't doing any AWS,
Yeah.
right? And so I had a loop, and during the loop, I had to do a business presentation, and a technical presentation. So I built an application. I have a Alexa. I live by the sea in a seaside town, and so I built a very.
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. Alexa's
I
still there.
should have coined it. And so I built an app that basically looked and used. So at the time, it's gone now. It's such a shame. There was a website called the Programmable Web, right? It was brilliant. It basically had. It was an infinite resource of all public APIs, right? You
Oh,
wanted
yeah.
something, you went to Programmable Web, you did a search, it
Yeah.
told you all the APIs available. I found one which basically did tides from the UK Admiralty. I got a free key. I created a Lambda function that basically returns the high tide and low tides it was hard coded to my address.
Location.
That was the only dodgy, sketchy coding I did. But I basically, I'd been using Azure Functions, which was the equivalent to Lambda, and I've been at the time Google didn't have an equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
I found the way to do it back. So this was back 2017, 16, 17. And I basically created this Lambda function in probably a few hours. Worked really well. Deployed it on Lambda, because in those days the Alexa would allow you to effectively trigger a Lambda function, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that was my demo. I managed to do it in 15 minutes, and I think I did an okay job. But yeah, so I think if for those of you who are interested in getting a job at AWS, yeah, focus on the leadership principles. But we are looking for people who have got a builder mindset, right? And so it will probably be expected that you build something or you show stuff you've built in the past. I've been building for like 30 years, so I had lots of things I was sharing and talking about. But yeah, that's pretty much the process.
Very cool. That was a lot of information. Thank you so much.
No,
one last thing is we met through a coffee chat. So
yes.
I guess if people want to connect with you particularly, you still offer them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're on that as well now, aren't you? So
yeah, we met through that.
Yeah,
yes.
So absolutely. I think it was from Fred Harbier.
Yeah.
I think he put it together a while ago. Great idea, and it's always important, right, for those of us who have been working to share some of the experience we have with the people coming through, right, the future generations of builders.
Yeah. There is an interview with Fred on this podcast too. I put myself out there too. I found you. So we put the link to the repository with the coffee chatters also in the show notes again.
Excellent
because
stuff.
That's excellent to just meet with people that are sharing the same mindset as you said.
Totally.
Yeah,
totally agree.
Other ways to get in contact with you? Are you on the socials or on LinkedIn,
on
X or something?
I left Twitter because it became too toxic.
Okay.
So you'll find me just on LinkedIn these days. Although I am on Mastodon and I'm on Blue Sky, but there's very little traffic on there, so you've got more chance of finding me on LinkedIn these days.
We put the link down in the show notes as well. Ricardo, that was nice. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. I loved it. A good chat.
Good chat. Thank you.